Okay, thank you for everyone for staying this long. I know everyone's angry, and thanks for accepting my talk so that I have a chance to revisit where I graduated from. So it's really nice to come back to attend this not great workshop, the conference. Myself, I have learned a lot from this conference. I don't have much background in neuroimage, but it's a nice chance to talk a little bit about my little ideas about spatial temporal modeling with application to neuroimaging study. Okay, so. So this slide shows that several brain images scanned at different time for Alzheimer's patients. There has been talked about it for different groups: cognitively normal and mild cognitively impaired and Alzheimer's disease. So probably from this slide you will not tell much difference. This is the fitted of these brain images averaging different people. So the focus here is not actually this main function of this functional image. So it's actually I focus on their spatial dependence, for example, between two different locations in a brain image, and how their spatial dependence evolve with time. So in other words, probably in this field you are more familiar with the terminology like the dynamic brain connectivity. So I try to use this so-called temporal evolution of spatial dependence in order to be more generic, so that it could apply to other image problems like the drone data or satellite data. The idea is that the HY value here would be the pixel value of this brain image, pixel value of this brain images. So it will be function of both the spatial location x and the time. So here you see 6 time points. So we hope that I can have more data from the different data sources, so that I've extended this study. So, but basically we use this more complicated Bayesian nonparametric involving Gaussian process with structured kernels, and with the focus on the temporal evolution of spatial dependence. As I mentioned, that there will be like the spatial dependence and how this spatial dependence change with time. So this could help us understand the mechanism of what is going on of the brain during the progression of, say, Alzheimer's disease. So, the observation will be non-ID, and my method will be different from the previous talks. So I don't discretize the spatial field into a fixed number of regions. Rather, I put a nonparametric way, nonparametric model, the Gaussian field. So you can have a natural way to generalize this what I call TESD to unknown locations. So this could be useful. So for example, you have a missing data in this drone, so you may not have this image data everywhere, but if you have this way, they have a built-in mechanism that naturally extend this relation to the unknown locations. Even if you don't, even if you do study the brain image, so you have this the high resolution. You have this full data, but it's also useful if you have like the low resolution. You want to have higher resolution image, and then you can have a natural way to extend to those unknown locations, so that especially with this TESD extended to the new locations. And I've mentioned that the TESD is temporal evolution of spatial dependence. So it's simply just the dynamic covariance between the two different locations conditioned on common time t. So we hope that this is something that it could change with time, so that give you some idea of what is going on about this spatial dependence with time t. And there's some existing literature in this field, like the spatial temporal Gaussian process, STGP. The classical one has this separable structure, and we will see that it fails in characterizing what I call temporal evolution of spatial dependence later on. And some people also treat the location and the time without any difference. So we can define this this full-size kernel. Again, so it's not a competition efficient. We will see some kind of thing later. And some people do this summation of a time kernel and spatial kernel and all the spatial temporal interaction in a separable fashion. Again, so they have here some issues of, especially in learning the TSD. So our contribution is that the generalize the separable one to this non-separable setting, and so that we can study the temporal evolution of spatial dependence more efficiently and more effectively. And we have some theoretical characterization of this covariance of the posterior contraction. So here's a slide of the table of contents. So I will talk about the generalization of the standard STGP, and then we'll talk about the posterior and the prediction. And then I will go quickly over a spatial, simulated spatial temporal Gaussian process, and then followed by a longitudinal analysis of Alzheimer's disease patients, and then conclude with future directions. So the Gaussian process regression is a very powerful tool in machine learning and statistics to model the functional data. So it is essentially understood as prior on function space to provide a flexibility in modeling function data to you have this flexibility in the magnitude and the smoothness and the variant patterns. And I don't have to say too much in this group of audience. And you have seen that once you have seen the data, you can talk about the uncertainty quantification through this posterior. And this is more mathematics. The posterior is again a Gaussian process. This is a general definition of a Gaussian process. And once it comes to the spatial temporal data, like the multiple brain images you scan at different time locations, so we could use this model. Well, the mean function is given a Gaussian process prior with this structured kernel. This is you can imagine that as an infinite dimensional covariance matrix, and this is for the spatial location. This is for the temporal domain. And the issue is that when you condition on common time t here, the covariance between these two locations has nothing to do with t. Okay, so essentially it fails to characterize the evolution of the spatial dependence of target. Okay, so that's the issue of the standard STGP with a separable kernel like this. And this is a very popular model in machine learning. And we see that the issue here is it does not work for our purpose. So there are many ways to generalize it. For example, you can introduce a time dependence to this model so that you have this time-dependent spatial kernel. And also another way is if you're familiar with this so-called dynamical covariance modeling, you can replace that dynamic covariance matrix with this time-dependent spatial kernel, so that you have this structure. And the targeted, the temporal evolution of spatial dependence would be mainly characterized by this key term, the time-dependent spatial kernel. So here is a little bit of comparison of these two models. So the first model is actually, you can write it as in this way, so that this kernel is actually called what I call the likelihood kernel. It doesn't have any useful structure here. So because in that model, originally it's think of this noise is assumed as a IID. Okay, so and if you write this way, so you don't have much structure in this likelihood kernel. And this I here is a direct function. Well, you only take one on a diagonal when x x prime are not the same, then you just take 0. The same for the t. And you put a lot of information on the prior, and then you will see that it creates some issue not only for the computation but also for the model. We'll see that later. And then the second model is something I want to advertise. So that's put a balanced structure in the likelihood, which is here, and also on the prior here. And if you look at the plot on the z is extended variable for location time. You'll see that this is by the way, so the red blocks, each of the red block is a spatial kernel, and we want to see that how it evolves with time. So each one will change with time. Okay, and this is our main focus. You see that the first model has put a lot of model details on off-diagonal blocks, and it is not computationally efficient. And this is also an issue for the full-size kernel. But for this one, it put enough details on this, and also you have some sparsity. There is more sparsity, more computationally efficient, and it has enough modeling details there. So I haven't talked about the details of the construction of the time-dependent spatial kernel. So it depends on the Mercer's representation theorem of the kernel. So we have this one, but for the spatial kernel, it does not change with time t. So our key thing here, key idea is that we let this lambda change with time t, and the model is an independent Gaussian process, and we require this. The assumption, essentially the eigenvalue will be function of time t, but the magnitude will decrease and it becomes somewhat. With this assumption, it's become well defined, and we can actually predict the TDST, the covariance to future time by replacing this lambda function in the definition with this predicted form, and also we can extend it to the unknown neighbors by the similar construction. And let's look at a simulation here. So here is some simulation data. So we create this with if you look at the correlation between two locations, it will change with time t. So our model shows that so there are 4 subpanels here. Each left subpanel is for the mean setting of mean. You see that the mean function is on our focus are relatively easy to study, but the covariance of selective locations, they are harder to learn. So here I plot covariance between selective locations as a pair, and you see that the dashed line are truths and the solid line are the estimates, and then the shaded region are the uncertainty. And the first model on this side, and the second model on this side, you see that due to the lack of structure in the likelihood model, so you will not learn the covariance pretty well. So this is some result for the prediction. Looks pretty well. So I don't have much time on the Alzheimer's disease. So it applies to the Alzheimer's disease. Data is chosen from the adenine data set. And the goal here is to categorize the change of the brain structure and again learn the spatial correlation between brain regions and describe its temporal evolution. And the challenge here is that the spatial kernel has discretized very large. And we use this so-called graph Laplacian that essentially the precision matrix is very sparse. And this is the our findings of the correlation between the region of interest and the point of interest across different groups. This is a prediction result, and this is one important result is that each color here, each point, the color here for each point indicates how correlated to other points. So essentially, you will see that for different groups. Especially for these two groups, mild cognitively impaired and Alzheimer's disease, so their cognition their connection between different regions will deteriorate. So they indicate that the brain degraded. So yeah, I'll stop here and then summary. Thank you.
Time for one question while our next speaker comes up. So our next speaker is Wang. She's at Washington State University, and she is talking on subgroup analysis using second-order imaging feature. Do you need help?
That's great.
Yeah. Clicker here.
Should I stay with this?
Yeah, or you can use this, whichever one.
Okay, I'll just stand up here. Okay, everyone. I'm Yuan from Washington State. Today I will talk about subgroup analysis using GLCM. Actually, this will be more exploring subgroup analysis using GLCM. So this is a project that I get to start very recently, and most of the time is spent on staring at the data, correct some mistakes. So a few months ago, I thought this will be a nice talk within a few months, and the same thing happened today. So I think within a few months, the talk will be much better, in much better shape. But here I just gather very quickly what I have been doing and share some of the thoughts with all of you. So Nico and Brian already gave a very nice introduction on radiomics. In cancer imaging, we often have these regions of interest. They could have different shapes, they have different types. And in radiomics, what we want to do is extract every possible piece of information we can from this radiology image. And hopefully with the extensive search of features, we can have a very thorough understanding of all those regions of different types. And among the very rich pool of radiomics features, I'm interested in one particular feature called GLCM. This is a grid level co-occurrence matrix. So this is a toy example that I'm trying to show you what this GLCM is doing. So on the left side, you have a matrix, but this is not always a matrix. It can be a sub-region. It can have a very ugly shape. And what we want to do is map it to the right side. And on this right side, the matrix here is defined by the intensity values we see on the original image. So this toy example, our original image only have 8 tones. So you can think that as 8 distinguished grade levels. So we can map it to an 8x8 GLCM matrix. So the very first thing we get is all those regions of different shape and size can be mapped to the same space. This 8x8 GLCM defined by the grade level co-occurrence. And the numbers inside this matrix tell us the spatial dependency in the original image. So one example here, we have a value 2, and this value 2 is at the matrix, the first row and the second column. So this is saying that there are 2 pairs of pixels, that one of them is at the grade level 1, the other is at the grade level 2. So it didn't tell us where those 2 pairs sit at, but we are still keeping that there are, among all the pixels in the original picture, there are 2 pairs of them is sitting at this co-occurrence 1, 2. So the spatial dependency is to some extent still preserved after we map it to this 8x8 GLCM space. Here is examples. These are the 2 liver regions of interest. And on this right side, this is GLC matrix we produced. So even though these original regions, the two of them are very different, but we are mapping them to the same space defined by their grid levels. And the only thing we need to have here is how do we decide the grid level bins. This is something that we can do. We have variable select choice that we can explore. So like I said, I'm still exploring. And the one we use here is we use the quantiles from the whole study over all the region, and we have equally spaced bins to have this initial analysis. Some advantage, why do I like GLCM? First, we do keep the spatial dependency in the original ROI. And the second is now we have this unified space regardless of the shape and the size of the original region. And this is also invariant to if you rotate or you shift your regions, the GLCM remain the same. The third one is less sensitive to coarse segmentation and registration. So I'm a little bit hesitant to put in here because I haven't fully assessed how sensitive or how much less sensitive that we can get. But when I first started working on with Chan, our radiologist collaborator, there is this study that we have 19 patients. So 19, not too many. I asked him, is this all we had? And he said, no, we had 40. But the other 21 patients has to be discarded because they cannot do a proper registration. And in that study, because they have a sequence of CT scan, and they have to register the sequence of CT images to have a compartment model that they can look at how the contrast media is traveling through our body. So they do have some registration issue there, but what I want to see is with this GLCM, can we propose some tools that has less demanding on the registration or ROI delineation technique, especially are we okay with some shaky hands or from our doctors? So that's one advantage. The last one is while we're constructing the GLCM, we dropped the pixel and ROI locations. So like we have two pairs of pixels sitting at that grid level co-occurrence, but we just discard where those two pairs are sitting at. So in neuroscience, this is not really a good thing. But in cancer imaging, where the liver tumor, they can appear everywhere. And we don't see a pattern that there is a distinguish between like upper side or bottom side. So we are dropping that, but hopefully we are keeping the essential spatial dependency in the neighborhood. So that's some nice thing about to just have a thought about GLCM. And what I did here in this exploring is we have a liver study, and there we have those liver metastatic sites, and we also have some healthy sites. And for each of the sites, we can construct the GLCM corresponding to all those regions we have. And in this study, we have 269 in total, and about half of them are the metastatic sites. So this initial analysis was just use what we have at this point and throw it in a random forest. And I did compare 3 different versions of random forest with various inputs. The first one is using the other radiomics features except GLCM. So the accuracy is 87%. And the second set is existing methods on GLCM is they will provide some summary statistics. And using that, we can also provide a random forest classifier. And this one here is we have a 90% accuracy. And this is we're not doing anything with GLCM. We just vectorize it, put it into the random forest classifier and see how that works. So it's comparable, a little bit better, but not really significantly better. So, but still, this is something that at least tells us that GLCM is still promising because we are keeping the spatial dependency, but we are still keeping our accuracy in the classification. Okay, so 5 minutes. The DL is a just something I play for fun. This is the deep learning algorithm that we want to see. So another nice thing about GLCM is since they are already in this well-defined space, so I can just send them into the CNN. So what we did here is just a 2-layer 2D CNN, and the accuracy is 69%. Now the only reason I put it here is it does not beat all the others. So, but I'm not saying that deep learning does not work here because I only consider 2-layer, and there are many other tuning parameters and structures we can keep explore. Another study is adrenal. So adrenal lesion is much more difficult to assess through the imaging we have. But this is something that we really want to work on because difficulty brings more space for improvement. And so Brian talked about his result with the accuracy about 80%. And here my accuracy is dropped. And this is not because our method or our explorers failed. It's because we are choosing a more difficult situations where the lesions we have here is if you only use the unenhanced scan, they cannot distinguish. So there is a follow-up delayed phase that they have the contrast median injected and wait and then scan again. So this is a more difficult group of patients to deal with. So we are not really surprised to see there is a 10% drop in the accuracy. So moving on, so the previous part is we do a supervised classification, but the more interesting problem here is if we decide to work on the GLCM, can we still discover some latent subgroups? So that can be helping us. Given the time I have, I will basically jump to the conclusion because the idea here is we want to build a metric. So if I have 200 patients, I want to have a 200 by 200 distance matrix, and this will be the input for my unsupervised clustering algorithm. The idea is I can put something into this matrix, and it's very light, it's very fast, and within seconds, we want to have a subgrouping result from this matrix we built using the GLCM. We have some results on the both liver and the adrenal study. So in this adrenal, using this unsupervised, so all we do is extract the GLCM, construct a matrix, send it into our graphical clustering model. And this is showing that in our first subtype, 77% is the malignant lesion, while in the other subtype, 64% is the benign. So we are finding subtypes across the lesion types, but this is not enough because we want to dive in the malignant lesion, whether there is subtypes and whether there is also subtypes in the benign lesion group. So a lot of potential here and future work. So one of the very interesting future work is in a longitudinal study case because adrenal lesion is very hard to deal with. So we do have a unenhanced scan in a separate visit typically, and then there is this delayed phase comes in later when the doctor sees is it necessary. So we do have different phases and how to combine it to help us better understand our lesion is one thing we want to consider. So I think that's the end of my talk, and this is just share with you some promising tools that we can from GLCM. I really liked it, and I will be happy to take any questions you have.
Time for a question.
So just thinking, so I know you applied like the convolutional, like the two-layer convolutional neural net. In a sense, isn't the GLCM kind of like like the first layer of a convolutional neural net, but with like a very, very simple filter bank?
Yes.
So, I mean, I'm just curious, like, if you compared it to instead, like, something trained on the original image, right? Because it seems like the value is actually in the way that you're doing local filtering, right, in order to, like, make your feature extraction be translation invariant.
Yeah, so it's true that the GLCM is already doing some neighboring aggregation, but because this is the case that we do not have the template that we registered to, so we did, in one of the long study, we do try work on the original image, but there are the regions of very different sizes, so we have to do a padding to map them into a common matrix space. So in this adrenal lesion, we haven't got there yet because the pre-processing is the time-consuming part. Yeah.
Question.
I would like
Next
to know
speaker
how
can
you
come up.
choose the levels of the GLCM, because you only got 8 levels of the gray scales. Like, how you choose this 8?
Yeah, so in that toy example, we choose 8 because there's only 8 distinguished gray levels. But in the other problems, the gray level can be ranging from, like for the liver, it's ranging from 900 to 100, 1200. So we tried several different choices for the beans. And the one future work actually is how we can select the beans in an optimal way. And presumably that will heavily impact our results on the GLCM. But that's part of the future work that we are going to keep explore.
Thank you.
So our third speaker is Jun-Young Park. He is at the University of Minnesota, and he's going to speak on semi-parametric modeling of time-varying activation and connectivity in task-based fMRI data. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Jun, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to give a talk here, and at the same time, I'm really thank you for your patience, because I know everyone here is tired now and hungry. And it is a co-work with Mark Vikas, who is also here, and as well as other collaborators in Germany and University of Minnesota. And here's the structure of my talk. I'm gonna first introduce 2 types of temporal dynamics of the fMRI time series, which are task activations, which corresponds to beta, and connectivity, which kind of corresponds to Pearson correlation between 2 time series. And then I'm gonna motivate our model called TVAC, which stands for time varying activation and connectivity, which estimates time varying activations and connectivity at the same time and applies bootstrap for statistical inference. And then I'm gonna apply our methods to one reinforcement learning experiment where participants gave verbal feedback right after their responses. And then I'm gonna end my talk with 1-slide discussions. So I'm gonna provide some review on activation and connectivity. So the first type of temporal dynamics is activation, usually in task-based experiments. Here, one or more experimental conditions are randomized and they're presented repeatedly to subjects. And a very standard model to analyze this kind of data is GLS, where W of T are adjusted covariates, for example, scanner drifts, and X of T consists of a convolution of a hemodynamic response function and a stimulus function. And here we assume that the hemodynamic response function is known, and it takes the canonical HRF. And beta is called activation effects, and it is one of our main interests here. And in GLS, it is assumed to be time invariant. And second type of temporal dynamics is connectivity, and most of the research has been done in resting state. And as I mentioned before, it is defined as the correlation between 2 or more time series, and when it is static over time, it is denoted as gamma in this slide between 2 time series. And recently, there are more and more growing statistical methods on estimating dynamic functional connectivity. And one of the standard methods in neuroimaging society is to use sliding window, but from the statistical society, there are more model-based estimates for multiple subjects as well as multiple regions. However, there's some like gap between like the current statistical methods in dynamic functional connectivity and estimating dynamic functional connectivity in task-based fMRI data. And I brought like two papers from NeuroImage, and they're pretty recent. And the first paper says that the connectivity in task-based experiments should account for confounding, like due to task. And for like statistical point of view, like it looks pretty straightforward. Like so, for example, in the previous slide, you regress out the like task activation effects using the GLS, and estimate the dynamic functional connectivity using the like residuals only. However, the like second paper pointed out that the task activation, even after they regress out the task activations, like produce a spurious and inflated estimate of connectivity. And what they also commented is that the flexible form of the activation effects reduce the biasness of the estimate for the functional connectivity. So in our model, we allow both activation and connectivity to be time varying, and we will be applying bootstrap for simultaneous inference on both beta and gamma of t. And our model consists of three steps. We first replace the beta as a function of time. So the expanded version is shown here. So if beta Rj is static over time, it's just GLS. And the second type of temporal dynamics, which is dynamic connectivity of order S, we are going to model using the time-varying vector autoregressive processes, which is the generalization of the autoregressive processes to incorporate multiple interdependencies between multiple regions, as well as the time-varying properties. And then the last component is noise, and we assume that it is independent of any type of temporal autocorrelation and has mean zero. And the TV bar itself, when all the phi is static over time, the off-diagonal element of the psi provides a measure of static functional connectivity. But if phis are time varying over time, from the TV bar itself doesn't provide a measure for dynamic functional connectivity, but we will be extracting the gamma of t from the TV bar equation. So to do so, we will first define the E of t. Please not to be confused with the epsilon. And E of t is the vectorization of the epsilons. And then we're gonna be constructing the expanded version of the state space equation as follows. And then we're gonna use the well-known result from the linear algebra to compute the vectorized covariance of the E of t. And from there, we're gonna be standardizing the covariance of the epsilon 1 and epsilon 2t to extract the gamma of t. And note that it is based on the assumption that covariance of the E of t is approximately equal to the covariance of the E of t minus 1. So a big picture of the estimation step is pretty straightforward. We're going to first fit a time-varying activation and using the residuals from the test activations, we are going to be fitting the TV bar processes, and then we will be applying bootstraps. And we use the linear mix framework extensively, and to do so, we rewrite as a stack of the linear mix models using splines. So suppose that beta of Rj of t is a sum of the time invariant component called beta Rj0 plus the spline expansions like this. So beta of k is the basis function for splines, and k is the number of knots we will be using. So rewriting the previous equation, it is just as treating u of rjk as random effects and estimating alphas and beta rj0 as fixed effects. And here we're going to assume that epsilon r of t is independent of any autocorrelations. And yeah, again, if u of rjk are all 0, it'll be reduced to the GLS. And for the TV bar processes, it can be decomposed as two different equations, one for epsilon 1 and one for epsilon 2. So we'll be fitting two other linear mixed models using the residuals from the first step. And similar to the first step, we can always rewrite the all of the phi as the sum of the time invariant components plus the spline expansions as so it can be like fitted by using the like linear mixed model framework. And finally, we're going to estimate the covariance of the delta 1 and delta 2 by its sample covariance. And for bootstrap, we're going to be resampling the estimated deltas with replacement, and from there we're going to be generating the bootstrap y called yr of like star, and then we are estimating beta of t's and like gamma of t's repeatedly, and we will be constructing the confidence bands. The reason we are using like bootstrap is that we are basically like feeding 4 like a linear mixed model, 2 for the activation and then 2 other for the for the TV bar processes. And each of them solves a form of likelihood, but like the set of all the parameters all together do not necessarily maximize a single form of likelihood. So yeah, so here we stick to the bootstrap. So I applied our methods to the reinforcement learning, and here's a brief description. And here each subject received like 4 different experimental conditions, and one of them were assigned as the target condition. The other condition is defined as the like non-target condition. And for the like target condition, the participants receive verbal feedback for their responses. And here I just reported the result for the 2 subjects and 2 region pairs, and the region pairs is Broadman area 32 and like sensory substantia nigra, as well as the like sensory cortex from the like left and right hemisphere. And to motivate our model, we first present the like behavioral data, not using any fMRI time series. So we computed the hit rate and the first alarm rate using the 3 equally divided like time intervals, and you see that like hit rate usually like goes up and both first alarm rate like goes down. So it kind of motivates our models to saying that like there might be something going on either on the like activation or connectivity or both. So here I like there are 6 figures here, and the first row is the result for the first region pair, and yeah, these 4 are the like the difference between the target and non-target conditions. So as you see from here, like the difference like is deviating from null as the time goes, and it looks dynamic, but otherwise like it looks pretty static. But I'll also comment that like when you like look at the individual like betas, I think beta for the target and beta for the non-target condition, like they are pretty like much dynamic, but they are very just like too close to each other, so that their difference is more like flat. And for the connectivity, like I compared my methods to sliding window approaches, like using the I applied sliding window to the like raw time series data, and saw that like saw some differences between our methods and sliding window approaches. And I think it kind of corresponds to the literature review, because like the sliding window usually like produces the inflated estimated connectivity. I'm not saying that like my estimate is the like global truth, but like there's some difference in our methods, and sliding window says that there might be something going on. And like for example, like if you see here, I first thought that like it is because of the like node placement, so I tried to increase the number of nodes and then see like what happens. But like this difference still like didn't disappear. So I'll say that like accounting for like dynamic properties of the test activation reduced the like biasness of the estimate. And yeah, and similar results were here. Like sliding window usually like overestimated the like functional connectivity. So I'm gonna like conclude my talk with like brief discussions. So in summary, like our methods called TBAC can capture like dynamic functional connectivity effectively in test-based fMRI by allowing activation effects to be like varying over time as well. However, like our methods is using splines, which means that it is based on the smoothness of the like activation of and the connectivity, which might not be true, because like in statistical literature, like there are some like models based on like change points, for example, or like for example switching bar. So, but we never know the truth of the like like the shape of the functional connectivity. So I'll just like stop it here. But like the extensions, it'll be incorporating multiple subjects and multiple like regions. Thanks.
Questions?
Yeah.
When you compared your method to the sliding windows,
Yeah.
did you compare it to the residuals after removing the task?
You mean dynamic activation or?
Right, because at the end you were comparing your method with the sliding window approach. Did you remove it, did you run it on the residuals after a G11 task?
The result provided here is not based on adjustment of the like time varying activations. So when I like fit it like GLS and then extract the residuals, the results are pretty similar to the sliding window as here.
Okay, but this is a task data, right?
Sorry.
This is task data.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you just ran the sliding window on the raw data.
Yeah.
Yeah. But your method removes the task, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you're removing the task, you're assuming a model for the hemodynamic response, right?
We assume that the magnitude of the HRF is changed over time.
Okay, so if you're not removing the hemodynamic response signal to the task perfectly, does that have any effect on your correlation estimates?
Could you say it again?
Well, you have some model for the hemodynamic response, right?
We assume that HRF is fixed, and just you just model the like magnitude of the like HRF.
And then you take out that signal, then you fit the correlations to what's
Yeah.
left over.
Yeah.
But it's not a model, right? If the hemodynamic response is not perfect. So some of your signal will be left in the residuals.
Yeah, it's possible. Okay.
What effect do you think that will have on your results?
Well, that's the like thing we don't really discover in this like, research. So, but I appreciate your comments.
But you could try simulating some stuff
Yeah.
and have a look.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Is that still pretty early?
It is submitted.
It's submitted? Okay. Is it reprinted or no?
This is how I
It is
got yours
reprinted.
to show.
Is it on archive or
It's
bioarchive?
on the Rockford website.
Oh, it's just on, okay.
Then you just click, just goes. That was not intuitive. Okay. So Ipek Oguz, how do you speak it?
Close enough.
Close enough. We're going to call it good enough for the last speaker of today. She is from Vanderbilt University and speaking on multi-atlas medical image synthesis. Thank you very much for being our last speaker today.
Thank you for the introduction. It's actually Ipek Oguz, but nobody gets that right. It's
Okay.
always fun at Starbucks. So thank you for staying with me here. I appreciate the tiredness in the room is palpable. So I'll try to keep it short and sweet. So I'm going to be talking about multi-atlas medical image synthesis. And I think a lot of you are familiar with multi-atlas methods that have been around for some time now. But just to get everybody on the same page about this, I'll do a quick review of this. So the idea typically is we have, in multi-atlas label fusion, we have a stack of atlases. And what's special about these things, what makes them atlases, is that whatever structure of interest we have, whether it's a single one or multiple one, we know where those things are in our atlases. So either somebody manually labeled them or we have some other existing segmentation tool. We somehow know where these structures of interest are in these atlases. So now what we do with these atlases is we get a new target image where we don't know the regions of interest are. And we're trying to segment this target image. So what we do is we take all of our atlases, we register them to our target image. And you can use any package for this. Things like ANTs are fantastic for it. So once I have all of my registered atlases, I'm going to forget about the labels for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at each registered image and compare it to my target image. And there's going to be, even though they're registered, because the registration is never perfect, there's going to be some residual error in there. So based on that residual error, I'm going to come up with some spatially varying weights that will be such that if there's very little residual error in my registration, they're going to be very similar to each other in that local patch, and I'm going to assign a high weight. And if there's a lot of error, it's going to be the opposite. It's going to have a low weight. If this was earlier in the day and we had more energy, we'd talk about what the details of this equation is, but we'll just not worry about that for now. So now I have this for my first atlas. I'm going to repeat doing this, come up with these weight maps for each of my atlases. So now I have this entire stack of them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to those labels I had, and I'm going to combine them, essentially doing a weighted sum of some sort, to try to come up with a consensus segmentation for my target image. So you could do this either by just doing a majority votes or something very simplistic like that, or you can use these weights that we have computed to come up with a more sort of sophisticated way of estimating the actual label in the image. Okay, so that's multi-atlas label fusion. None of that is my contribution. So what I'm going to do is something similar but a little different. So I'm going to instead look at multi-atlas intensity fusion. And what's interesting here is I still have the same atlases, but I don't have any labels. So what I'm going to do is I still have a target image I'm interested in analyzing. And remember, a lot of what I did in the multi-atlas label fusion, I can still do without labels. The labels don't come into play until that very last combination step. So I can still do the same thing. I begin by registering my atlases to my target image. So now everybody is registered in the same space, in the target image's anatomical space. And I can still go one by one, compare the registered image to the target image, come up with the residual error, compute a weight based on that. So I can do this for everyone, just like before. And now I have this stack of weights, and since I don't have any labels to look at, I'm going to look at the atlases themselves, the grayscale MR images, or whatever kind of images that you're working with. And I'm going to combine these using the weights into a consensus image, and you have to do some intensity normalization for this to work. But once you do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine these actual images, the grayscale images themselves, into a consensus synthesis image. Now you'll notice that this looks a lot like my input image, my target image that I started out with, so this looks like a lot of work for no apparent reason, right? But there's actually interesting applications where this does something more interesting than just repeating or mimicking the input image. Let me see. So I should mention that there is a implementation of this in the ANS package that we heard about earlier today by Niklas Thyssen. But so let's talk about when this is an interesting thing to do. So one way to think about this is as a projection problem. So if we have our atlases in some manifold, in some distribution, so let's say that they're healthy brains, or they're young brains, or they're old brains, something like this. We can think of what I'm doing in this intensity fusion step as a projection onto the space of that distribution. So if you have this space that they're living in, if your image is already, your target image, if it's already in that space, that projection ends up being a very short one. It's essentially just smoothing out some noise, and it doesn't do anything very interesting. But if you are, for some reason, outside of that distribution, for example, if you are not a healthy brain, if you are not a young brain, old brain, whatever it might be, then you are essentially imposing that characteristic that's shared by the atlases, but not by the target image, onto the target image. Some related ideas to this, which I'm not going to get into, is you can look at this as a non-parametric regression. And this is also related to non-local means algorithms, for those of you who are familiar with it. But so here's some applications where this is of interest. So for example, if I have an anatomical abnormality, which I would like to remove, I can do this by having my atlases be healthy brains that don't have this abnormality, and I can impose that non-abnormality characteristic into my image. As a side product of this, I can actually detect the abnormality. I can do image artifact removal in things like structured, like cortical ringing kind of artifacts. I can do noise reduction or SNR improvement. I can do cross-modality synthesis. So for example, if all my atlases are T1 weighted images, but my target image is T2, I can come up with the T1 version of that T2 image by using this. You can also do things like image harmonization. If you have a multi-site study where everybody has their own scanner, their own protocols, and the data comes out looking very, very diverse, you can use this to try to bring that to a more common appearance. And you can do super resolution kinds of things. So for example, if you have 70 atlases and you have one 3D image that is your target image, you could come up with what the super resolution version of that 3D brain would look like. Now I'm going to talk about the first couple of these applications, and I'm going to essentially just flash pretty images because there is not enough time. So the first one I'm going to talk about is image inpainting. So I'm going to look at multiple sclerosis, where we're interested in lesion removal. So we heard about cortical thickness earlier today in a couple of the talks. In multiple sclerosis, there's white matter lesions that are typically what people are interested in analyzing. But there's more and more evidence that the cortical thickness is also a biomarker, a potential biomarker of interest. The problem is because of white matter lesions, it's very difficult to get standard tools like FreeSurfer to work properly on these data. So especially when these white matter lesions occur very close to the juxtacortical spaces, then this causes trouble. And the current solution is essentially to inpaint these lesions, which is exactly what it sounds like. You take a brush, you paint it through so that it looks more like normal tissue, and now you apply FreeSurfer or ANS or whatever your favorite tool is. The problem is because of the segmentation of lesions is a complicated problem in itself, we don't want to be dependent on that, and manual segmentation of lesions even is still very prone to inter-rater differences, variabilities. So we want to see if we can instead come up with the in-painted version without going through the lesion segmentation step. And I'm going to use this intense diffusion idea that I talked about. My atlases are going to be healthy brains with no lesions, and my target images will have, they are MS patients, so they will have these lesions. So here's what this looks like in practice. On the left is a real image, as in it's acquired, of a multiple sclerosis patient. You can see a large, I think I have a flag coming up for it, a large lesion up here, and on the right is my synthesized image, where I didn't segment the lesion, I just did this in painting without going through that at all. I'm going to show a couple more of these. Again, you can see these larger ones pretty easily. Here's one that I really like because this one has not only multiple of these large sort of nasty lesions, but also on this, let me see, can you see my cursor? I guess not, but on the other hemisphere you can see sort of these smaller lesions that are all over the place, and I'm able to remove all of these without having to segment a single one of them. Now, since the reason I'm doing this is cortical thickness computation, so I'm going to do that, I'm going to see if this works for that purpose. So I'm going to start with an image. I'm going to be focusing in this sort of insular area. Here's what that looks like. You can see that there's a couple of lesions in there. And if I just run FreeSurfer from the original image, it gets drawn to all of these things. So in these regions here, you can see that there's two of them that are very focal, and FreeSurfer gets the wrong surface because those lesions look just like cortical gray matter. So instead, if I run it on the synthesized data, I'm able to avoid all of those things. And here's a couple of flags. So here's one that's very sort of diffuse. Here's another one. And here's a couple of them that are sort of grouped together, clustered together. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the red surface from the original FreeSurfer and the yellow surface from the synthesized FreeSurfer and put them on top of each other so you can appreciate the differences between them. So you can see that in all of those places where we saw the lesions, the surfaces are changing as we want them to. But in the places where there is no lesion, they're not changing. So I'm not introducing some sort of arbitrary changes to my surfaces. Of course, because this is based on a registration, my caveat is that if the registration fails, this just doesn't work. So for example, there's this one example where a juxtaventricular lesion gets thought to be, by the registration algorithm, it wants to register the ventricle through that instead of actually doing the proper thing. So that kind of breakage can happen occasionally. And we're currently working on how to detecting this automatically. So now once I have these in-painted lesions, what I can do is I can play that game where you have the flag differences kind of thing between two very similar pictures, because those differences will give me the lesion segmentation, because those are the artifact or abnormality that I have removed. So I'm going to again be using a multiple sclerosis data set. I'm going to do OASIS, which I think most of you are familiar with. This is work that came out of people like Takeshi Noura, Elizabeth Sweeney. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to either train an OSS model on just the original images or the original images plus the synthesized images and see if one does better than the other. Like so. So I'm going to, on these I have manual segmentation of my lesions, so I can actually compare the accuracy, the dice overlap. And sure enough, introducing these synthesized images does improve the accuracy of the segmentation. So that's all I'm going to say about this one, and then the last thing I want to show is image filtering. So if I have good quality images versus poor quality images, I can use those good quality images to improve the quality of my poor quality images. That's a lot of qualities in that sentence. And the motivation for this is Huntington's disease, which is a motor disorder where the patients have a lot of trouble staying still in the scanner. So we try to get very quick acquisition so that they're in and out as fast as we can, which means that we have a very poor SNR in those images. Unfortunately, the structures that we are interested in Huntington's are these deep brain structures like the caudate and the putamen, and as further into the brain you go, the more signal drops, so it's just very difficult to segment these things in these images. So we're going to use these atlases that are from a publicly available data set, and our target images are these HD Huntington's patients with a very rapid acquisition. On the left is the original acquired image. On the right is the same thing after the filtering. And you can appreciate, if you look back at those structures that I'm interested in segmenting, the improvement in SNR is obvious even on the projector, which is not doing it justice. If you squint just right, you can also see the cortical ringing on the original image, and you can see that we are also able to remove that. Now I'm going to put these two things on top of each other and flip back and forth so you can appreciate the effect. And you can see that it's not really changing the boundaries of the image, it's just sort of injecting signal to it, if you will. Here's a couple more examples. I'm going to do the same thing. These are 3 different subjects. I'm going to flip back and forth between the before and after. Oops. And you can see that, for example, in the very first one, that polylus, which is, if I can get my cursor out here, which doesn't have much signal, much contrast at all in the original image, because my atlases have good iron deposition contrast. I'm able to actually bring that out, which isn't at all in there in the original image. Okay, so the one caveat that I want to mention about this is a really expensive filter. So if your images are pretty good and you can probably get away with just a little Gaussian filtering, quite all right. I'm about to finish, I promise. So if you can get away with just some Gaussian filtering, you should do that, because this takes a lot of time because we're doing a lot of registrations. But in conclusion, we have shown this in a lot of applications, and there's many more, like I have mentioned. And if you are interested in talking about any of these, my email is on there. Thank you for listening. Dinner is ready for now for you guys. I'm happy to take questions, but you can't be angry at me. Right. Yeah.
First, some excellent results you have here.
Thank you.
One thing that I'm curious about is the increase in signal to noise ratio is pretty apparent. But how does that affect, say, afterwards, all the stats analyses? In particular, I'm a little bit concerned on what it will do with respect to your, say, power type 1 error.
Right, and so, because it's, at the end of the day, if you think about it, it's a very fancy way of averaging data, right? I'm doing all this analysis for how to compute these weights, but then at the end, I'm doing a weighted average. So it is, of course, blurring the images a little bit. And you can play with how much blurring you want by changing the number of atlases that you're using. The more you have, of course, it's going to blur more because you're averaging more data. But you can also then try to rely on better registration, so you're like getting really crisp edges versus perhaps if you care more about more global effect, for example, with those like very poor images that we have, you care more about those than the very tiny little details. You can sort of play with those things. But yes, that is, of course, a concern, absolutely.